It is a day that a lot of professional wrestling fans probably didn't think was ever going to happen because, of course, Hulkamania is going to live forever. Hulk Hogan, better known as Terry Bollea in his civilian life, passed away on Thursday at the age of 71. And to get a little local look at things, I'm going to bring in a fellow gigantic Hulk Hogan fan. You probably know him better from his UNK ties and his time on the radio, Brandon Benitz. Brandon, thank you so much for giving me a few minutes today.
Christian, I appreciate it. It's always good to be able to reminisce with a fellow believer.
So, what makes this really interesting, not only are you a diehard Hulk Hogan fan from being a kid, I'm sure, you're currently in Florida. Like the Hulkster was in Clearwater, and that's where he unfortunately passed away this morning as we're taping this. You're not that far away from there.
Right now, I'm about an hour and 15 minutes south of Tampa. My dad and his wife retired a number of years ago to Venice, right along the Gulf Coast here. And over the last several years, I've been able to come down and spend some time with them. And during some of those times, I've been able to make two different, what I call pilgrimages to his original beach shop there on the beach in Clearwater. And he's since expanded those shops to other locations, Orlando and some other places. But I've been able to visit not once, but twice his beach shop, come away with a couple of artifacts, just my own personal connection to the fandom that is Hulkamania.
We were talking before we started recording this about the time you got to meet Hulk Hogan. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's a loose interpretation of the term meet. I can't say that I ever shook his hand, but years and years ago, back when I was at UNK full time, I was down in Clearwater at the Sheraton Sand Key for a conference. And we had an overflow crowd in the Ramada just across the street from there. And as I'm walking out of that hotel, I can see this very bright yellow Dodge Ram pickup truck. There's a blonde lady sitting in the driver's seat, and a guy with the largest arms I'd ever seen in my life was leaning in the window talking to her. At the same time, I see this completely decked out Cadillac Escalade. There's a lot of money in this vehicle, and I could hear the bass coming from it, and there's chrome everywhere. And I hear this little bitty pipsqueak voice that just says, Hulkster, Hulkster. And then it hits me. It all comes together. The little pipsqueak voice is Mouth of the South, Jimmy Hart. That means the blonde-haired lady driving the pickup is Brooke. And then, like in the movies where the main character is in front of the camera and the rest of it pulls back from the camera, that's when it all coalesced. That the guy with the huge arms is one of my genuine heroes in life, Hulk Hogan. And I do what many people do when they get to meet one of the great icons of their life. I completely went mute. I didn't know what to say. And this is in the days before smartphones. So I had an old school flip phone, never thought to take a picture. And finally, I was able to utter the words, Hey, Hulkster, just to try and get his attention. And he had no idea who he was talking to. He had no idea about anything. He just turned around, and even before he started turning, just, hey, how you doing, brother? And at that point in time, I almost passed out because I realized that my immortal icon, great hero in my life, Hulk Hogan, actually spoke to me. I have I have lived that day vicariously so many times since. It was one of my greatest days ever.
That's a ton of fun. I've never had that opportunity, but getting to see him wrestle in 2005 in Pittsburgh live was fun. Just growing up as a kid, and I want to ask you the same thing. I'm 41, so I'm kind of in that sweet spot of age of, you're raised by your mother, your father, and the television. So you got Hulk Hogan on there telling you the three demandments of Hulkamania, which I'm sure you know all too well. What got you into what got you drawn to the Hulkster, I guess?
My first connection was just seeing the reruns of Rocky 3. Growing up in the small town that I did, we didn't really have cable, so we couldn't watch wrestling. And my great grandmother was a huge wrestling fan, so there was a small connection there. But really, it was when my family moved from one town to another in 1986, and we actually had cable and we could watch over and over again the Saturday night main events and all the different wrestling programs that were out there that were only available via cable. And at that time, I was 10 years old, and like any other impressionable 10-year-old, you watch and you emulate what you see on TV. And you're right with the demandments of the training, the prayers, and the vitamins. I grew up on that and the pose down. And there were so many life lessons that the character of Hulk Hogan connected with me. You can make mistakes and you can still come out on top, or you can be really down in the middle of a match and you can Hulk up and you can do your thing and get the crowd behind you and ended up pinning the guy for the win. The hindsight of being a little older than 41 has allowed me to see that the man, Terry Gene Bollea, of course, had his character flaws, no question about that. But the character of Hulk Hogan and what it meant and what it aspired to is something that I will always carry with me.
And he did things that, had never been seen before in professional wrestling or pop culture for that matter. If I am correct, I believe he was the first professional wrestler to ever grace the cover of Sports Illustrated. He was on Johnny Carson. I mean, God bless all of the late night talk shows. And that's a big story right now in its own right, but nobody tops Johnny Carson. And you're on there as a wrestler in the 80s. You're starting to make that big, giant national global jump. And he was the one that did it. And I think, you could talk about promoters and all these different things, but one guy with 24-inch pythons, and he's the one that carried it on his back.
And that's one of the great things about this character is his arms may not have been 24 inches, but there's an entire generation of young men that grew up measuring their biceps because Hulk Hogan had it. We wanted it too. In a word, I think one of the great appeals for Hulk Hogan is that he was probably the first to really cross over from wrestling, and certainly it was regionalized before Vince McMahon Jr. started to buy up all the different regions and take it more national. He, along with Vince McMahon Jr. and the production quality, if you look at what TV looked like in wrestling before Hulk Hogan and what it looked like during his rise, he kind of hit that sweet spot of Vince McMahon putting quality production behind the main character draw. And if you look at what was going on late night, sure, Andre the Giant had made a few appearances on Letterman even before Carson, but he really didn't have that crossover appeal. When you had somebody like Hogan that was on not only Carson, but also on Arsenio Hall, he was on, as you said, the cover of Sports Illustrated. He also had the Rock and Wrestling cartoon for a number of years. He was on the A-Team. He was on Knight Rider. He was on a lot of those shows that also growing up as a kid that you watched. And so there was a lot of that. He tried his hand in movies and, marginally successful, I suppose would be a generous a contribution for that. But if you look at all those things that he did that no one else did and no one else had really thought to do and no one else could connect with, he was a big, big time crossover appeal.
Now, Suburban Commando is a classic, and you know it.
Only if you redefine the term classic.
Anyway, maybe, but I enjoyed it. It was fun. So I was just walking through things, and of course, Hulk Hogan then transformed at some point. The cheers were starting to kind of go away in the early to mid '90s, and he was approached about turning into a villain or a heel, as a wrestling parlance, and he did that, and he created the NWO with Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, and then everything changed, and then you got another peak period, another boom period, as it's called in the wrestling business, for ratings and probably even bigger than the one he had when Hulkamania started.
If you look at the entirety of his career, he had played a heel a number of times back when he was with Vern Gagne and the NWA in Minnesota. And he actually had to go back there because of his role in Rocky 3. Vince McMahon Sr. wouldn't allow him to come back to what was then the WWF, of course, now WWE. So he essentially got fired, went back to the NWA, and that's where he learned two things. One, he learned that it's a lot better to be the baby face instead of the heel. So he turned and came back to that baby face. That's also the first time that he had the T-shirt ripped off of him. And Paul Orndorff and one of the Gagne brothers were actually the first to do the T-shirt. They ripped the T-shirt off of him, and then after that, the legend was born. He started, of course, to do it himself. So he had been a heel, became a babyface. And you could only do that in wrestling for so long before changes needed. It got kind of boring, got kind of stale. As wholesome as it was, it got kind of old. And then he reinvented himself, and I completely agree. In the late 90s, when he was leading the NWO and the Wolfpack before that, if you look at what the ratings were like, NWO and the Monday Night Wars were beating WWF, WWE for a number of weeks, and that was the biggest ticket in town.
And I believe if you add up, and I know this isn't how it works because people watch both at the same time, flip back and forth, but if you add up the ratings on both, there were like 10 million people supposedly across the country watching wrestling on a Monday night. Nothing outside of the, football gets 10 million people to watch anymore. That's just not how it works.
It was good, raucous fun. Now, of course, there was a lot of that where, unfortunately, you had some younger kids, mostly young boys, that were trying to emulate some of the moves, and they had to tamp that down a little bit. But when you had a good chunk of the entirety of the country viewers watching TV, watching either WWF, WWE, or NWO and the Monday Night Wars, it was incredible that everybody was rooting for one of those factions.
I mean, we could do this for an hour. I mean, and I would be totally fine with it. Again, the character, Hulk Hogan. I agree with you. I just had that exact same conversation with somebody before we sat down and did this. That, to be fair, Terry Gene Bollea is a human. I mean, he agree or disagree. Of course, he had some bad things in there. I mean, that we could talk about too. But he's flawed. He has issues. There were problems, and I think last year he became a born again Christian and was baptized. And there's video of that surfaced again today on Twitter. So there's that. But Hulk Hogan, the character, the image of the red and yellow and the red, white, and blue, real American, and I believe I'm blanking unfortunately on the man's name that did Real American. I believe he just passed away not that long ago.
I
The
believe it was just a couple of months ago. Yeah,
Yeah.
very
So
shortly ago.
that song, because of the Hulk Hogan character, kind of became a really big thing. Heck, it's even been played at White House Correspondents' dinners. That was Obama taking a shot at President Trump, but that's a whole different thing. Um, but just like it's hard to put into words, and I think you've done a really, really good job at it of what Hulk Hogan meant to the country and pop culture. And just, I mean, in 1988, on the main event, him and Andre the Giant live in, I think, Indianapolis. Why I know these things is a whole other problem, but over 30 million people watched that happen. And that, again, outside of a Super Bowl, that doesn't happen anymore. And again, there's good reason for that. There's streaming and 500 channels and all that stuff. But the idea that this 6'6", 6'7" bass guitarist or whatever from Florida could turn into this guy who captivated not just the country but a large portion of the world. It's amazing.
When you look at what he was able to do, as you mentioned, he was a bass player. The band was named Ruckus from here in the Tampa area. And there were a couple of wrestlers that would frequent one of his clubs. And he was a very large individual. If you go back and look, his parents were average size at best. And he just happened to be a little larger than everyone else. And they thought he would be a great wrestler. He was working on the docks at the time, started some wrestling, had to go back to the docks, came back and really honed his craft and kind of took off of the character of superstar Billy Graham, especially when he would raise up on the ropes and hit the big double biceps and start to pose down at the end of every win. And he really had a sense of charisma that when he turned it on, he didn't really ever have a peer. And, the Ultimate Warrior would come in and run around. And then you would have guys like Jake the Snake Roberts that would just walk real slow, or The Undertaker that would no sell everything. When you had Hulk Hogan, you just had a little bit of everything. And especially when you had, the bright colors and you had, the off orange, red, and you had the yellow, and, you had just the vibrancy of somebody that was out for truth, justice, and the American way. There was a little bit of that kind of Superman hero worship. And I have to admit, I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I was one of the great things about growing up is you always wanted to root for Hulk Hogan. And, even if he lost, you were still in his corner. And one of those great things. First time I ever heard the term immortality and Hulkamania was after he lost at WrestleMania 6 in the Sky Dome to Ultimate Warrior, the champion versus champion belt for belt match. And at the end, he lost by the obligatory just millisecond, couldn't kick out in time. Ultimate Warrior won both belts, and the first thing Hogan did was went and grabbed his belt, handed it to the Ultimate Warrior. They had a big hug. So again, as a kid, the life lesson there of so many was the fact that, hey, you lost fair and square. You shake the hand of the man, you hug the man who beat you, you handed him the belt, and he walked off with his head held high.
This has been a great conversation. What would be one final thing that you take away from today of the Hulkster's passing?
Just the overall experience of who that character was and how he was able to come out of that character. And there's an interview that he did years ago where he talked about the character of Hulk Hogan has made Terry Jean Bollea a better person. And if you look at the things that he has done, yes, there were mistakes made in his personal life. I'm sure there were mistakes made in the ring. He probably wasn't the best technical wrestler out there. But again, this isn't wrestling as we know it for the Lopers and the Huskers and, NCAA wrestling. This is wrestling. And for one of the better wrestlers, he's on my Mount Rushmore of all-time wrestling personalities out there for all of the things that he did and all the things that he meant to a young boy growing up. Hulkamania is immortal.
Indeed, it is. Brandon Benitz from Florida, just a couple stones throw away from where the Hulkster called home in Clearwater, Florida. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes today.
Christian, I may stop by the beach shop tomorrow, and if I do, I'll pick you something up, brother.
Sounds good, dude.